All right, welcome everyone. I know we just started, it's starting in a minute still. Thanks for joining us after your lunch break. Um, we are so excited to begin our second day of sessions for the Connecticut Affordable Housing Conference. Yesterday was fantastic. This morning was great. I hope you're able to attend all of our keynote and plenary sessions because we really learned a lot, and we're really excited now to hear from the folks at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. My name is Alicia Gardner. I'm a senior policy analyst here at the partnership. And my colleague, Michelle Montano, is also on the call today. So if anyone has any technical issues, feel free to message us directly and we'll try and help you out there. This year, our theme is Here for Housing. And if you're on socials, you can join us at CAHC 2024 on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, or wherever you are. This session is entitled Exploring Fair Rent Commissions, Tools and Resources to Increase Housing Stability. I am personally super excited about this as fair rent commissions have continued to gain some legal teeth and pop up more across the state to hear how they're doing and what they can do in our housing landscape. Before we turn it over to our presenters, we'd like to thank our presenting sponsor, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, our visionary sponsor, Wells Fargo, our champion sponsors, Liberty Bank, the Connecticut Department of Housing, Cone Resnick, Trinity Financial, JD Million Associates, and Robinson & Cole, and our foundation sponsors. The support has allowed us to keep this conference momentum going and make it free for everyone to attend. So we're very grateful for their support. It's also fantastic to just see how many different entities across the state really care and are invested in housing. So we appreciate seeing the broad range of support across the state. And last but not least, a big thank you to our featured investor, CHR, Real Life, Real Hope, for helping to make this conference accessible to all. Just a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to our presenters. Our session is being recorded and we'll make all recordings available as soon as possible on the partnership's YouTube channel. Please remain on mute unless a speaker asks you to unmute. If you have a technology issue, please select the chat icon in the Zoom control panel and you can send it in the chat to myself or Michelle, and we'll do our best to help you out. And then for the question and answers, please hold your questions to the end, and then you can type them in the chat. And Sarah and Rafi and Dahlia will be able to call on you if they need any extra clarification, but please drop your questions in the chat. And now I'd like to turn the time over to the Connecticut Fair Housing Center and Sarah White to introduce herself and the discussion today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this discussion today about fair rent commissions. Just a note about our format today. Sorry, my cat is really wanting to participate. We're going to do a short presentation about the history of fair rent commissions, why we have them, how to use them, what they can do, and then have some time to answer questions and have more of a discussion. So as we're doing our presentation, you can throw any questions that pop into your head in the chat, but we're going to wait till the end to get to those and any others that you have. And before we get started, we're just going to introduce ourselves. My name is Sarah White. I'm an attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. And one of the things I've been doing the past couple of years is working with municipalities to start or revive their fair rent commissions, including, drafting the toolkit with Rafi and Dahlia and others through the partnership that had a model ordinance that has FAQs, and then providing technical assistance to fair rent commissions, as well as helping tenant groups use them and improve them so that they can, give more folks in our state housing stability. I will pass it to Rafi to introduce himself.
Sorry, I have to remember to unmute myself. I'm Rafi Podolsky. I'm a lawyer with Connecticut Legal Services, but I'm the housing policy advocate for all three of the major legal aid programs in Connecticut. Along with Sarah, we've worked on putting together a toolkit for fair rent commissioners. We've run a series of workshops for commission staff and commissioners to help them understand what's involved in running and being involved in a commission. And the materials that we've used are available online, so that there are things other people can get to. And I have my own unique little piece of history in this, because years ago I was a member of the Hartford, Connecticut Fair Rent Commission. And so I actually have some experience in being on a Fair Rent Commission and deciding cases the way I would hope Fair Rent Commissions would decide them today. So thank you. And I guess on to Dahlia.
Thanks. Dahlia Romanow. I'm also a staff attorney at the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. And for the past couple of years, I've been focused on representing tenants in Fair Rent Commission complaints. So I've had the opportunity to work with several different Fair Rent Commissions across the state at this point. And I will be sharing the slideshow. So let me see if I can do this. It did work when I practiced it. Okay. Can everyone see that okay? Awesome. All right. Let's kick it off. Okay, so I think I've got this slide. Well, so for an agenda, Sarah kind of went over this, but we'll be going into why Fair Rent Commissions are necessary, including some history of Fair Rent Commissions in the state of Connecticut, what Fair Rent Commissions can do, and then how tenants can make use of Fair Rent Commissions. To start, let's ground ourselves. What is a Fair Rent Commission? A Fair Rent Commission is a municipal board. So I usually will compare it to like a zoning board or something like that. It's made up of volunteers who live in the municipality. The commission has the power to limit or modify rent increases and other rental charges to prevent them from being so excessive that they're harsh and unconscionable. That's the language in the state statute. And the commission can reset rental charges to a fair and equitable amount. Fair Rent Commissions are hearing individual cases. So tenants come to the commission with a complaint, and then the Fair Rent Commission is looking at that tenant's individual case. They hold hearings, they make decisions. They also have other functions, which we'll get into later in this presentation. And the decisions that Fair Rent Commissions issue have the force of law. And I will pass it to Rafi. Is this you?
Yeah, so I guess I want to say a little bit here about why Fair Rent Commissions are necessary. For most tenants, there is no way to challenge a harsh or an unfair rent increase unless your town has a Fair Rent Commission. So as a practical matter, the town needs to have a Fair Rent Commission for tenants to be able to be heard on the very issue. Under existing law now, towns with more than 25,000 people have to have such a commission. With the exception of certain elderly and disabled tenants who live in larger buildings, a tenant cannot go to court in order to ask a judge to determine that a decision is that a rent increase is unfair. So from that perspective, when you look at the standard for Fair Rent Commissions, from that perspective, what a Fair Rent Commission is doing is it is functioning as a kind of conscience of the community, so that, as to what is fair and reasonable in regard to rental charges. That's really its function. And that's the reason that commissioners on Fair Rent Commissions generally they're not experts. They're lay people. They're not technically volunteers, but they're not paid. So they are appointed through whatever the governmental structure is for the municipality. Next slide. How do Fair Rent Commissions protect the community? Fair Rent Commissions are a piece of the effort to in a sense, stabilize housings for residents, which translates into making it possible for people who are already living in an apartment to stay there and not be driven out by unreasonable rent increases. And part of what that does, what housing stabilization does, is it creates an environment in which renters are not unnecessarily forced to move. It recognizes the importance of tenants being able to stay in their homes and be part of a neighborhood and be part of a community. And a lot of those tenants will be people who've been there for a long time. and really have based their lives in a particular community, and they're leaving. It's harmful to the community, but it's harmful to them. Fair rent commissions can be an important protection against high rent increases, especially those that are imposed by entities that purchase properties for investment, that drive, because those rent increases drive tenants out of their homes and neighborhoods. Many of these investors are out-of-state corporations with little interest in preserving existing low-cost housing. And that's a significant part of this, because a lot of the low-cost housing is older and is priced lower. And when you bring in and change the situation, you end up significantly raising the cost for renters. And also you change the nature of what I would call landlording. That is to say, it makes a difference from people who are based in the community and are also own property that they rent versus people for whom it's simply an investment, and tenants are all fungible and interchangeable. Next slide. I think next slide is Sarah.
Yeah, and I'm going to contextualize fair rent commissions a little bit and talk about, the history of fair rent commissions in our state. So fair rent commissions are a form of rent stabilization, which just means having some reasonable external limits on a landlord's ability to raise rent, so tenants can have more housing stability, predictable increases, things like that. And rent stabilization is really a menu of options. It is not just a single policy. It's everything that ranges on, a rent cap on someone's individual rent, which could be local or statewide, to system-wide regulation like rent control, where the amount of rent is actually being set by a board. Fair rent commissions in Connecticut are sort of individualized rent stabilization. They don't regulate the market as a whole. They don't provide an overall cap on rent increases, but for tenants who are already living in their apartments and are experiencing an increase or feel their renter charges are unfair, they're able to get individualized relief. Can I have the next slide? And I'm going to share a little bit about the history of rent stabilization in Connecticut. So it actually, as I've been able to find out, goes back to World War I, when there was federal rent stabilization, as well as in Connecticut, some local rent freezes, like in Hartford, as well as municipal boards that functioned similar in some ways to our modern fair rent commissions, which were designed to give tenants a place to complain if there were unfair rent increases and provide more stability. They returned again during World War II, where there was national rent control that covered 80% of the rental market. And here in Connecticut, again, a system of local fair rent commissions is actually what they were called, which were supposed to, process complaints, provide, ensure that the rent control regime was being followed and there wasn't price gouging. Cities continued to have rent control until the late 1950s, when the Supreme Court found that, following action by the legislature, there was no longer local authority for rent control. But the problem remained that in some cities, many cities, there continued to be landlords that were raising rent significantly, often without providing safe housing. And cities continued to try to find solutions. Here in Hartford, they tried to create another fair rent commission that was toothless, that didn't work. And then in 1969, a number of tenant groups, welfare rights organizations, a huge organized effort went to the legislature and was able to create the law that we still have today, authorizing municipalities to set up fair rent commissions that actually have the power, the force of law to, lower rent or limit rent increases. And that's the regime we still have today, but it comes out of that broader history, both of organizing and the context of, many different ways Connecticut has tried to have, rent control or rent stabilization throughout the 20th century. So after that law was passed in the 1960s, Stamford, Hartford, and New Haven immediately created fair rent commissions, and there were organizing efforts in a lot of our communities, especially in Waterbury, where many tenants and welfare recipients went to the legislature asking for this law, knowing that it was going to be hard politically to get one set up, in Willimantic and Meriden to set up fair rent commissions as well. So in the 70s and 80s, fair rent commissions were incredibly active. There were over 25 in Connecticut, as well as a statewide coalition of fair rent commissions, which we're rebuilding today, which is really exciting. But then during the 2000s, around the time when I moved to Connecticut, many fair rent commissions became dormant. rent was pretty flat. There was, you know, overall in many cities, sort of a disinvestment in public services. But then things really changed in the pandemic, where, as Rafi was saying, we saw a huge shift in our housing market, where a lot of corporate out-of-state landlords came in during the pandemic looking to take advantage of the situation, everyone's need for housing, and bought properties with the intent of really drastically increasing rent. We know that the overall rent increase statewide was like around 20% in 2 years, but there are so many situations we've learned about from tenants or through organizing where landlords effectively doubled people's rent overnight. And fair rent commissions became incredibly important as a tool to try to fight back against these huge increases that are really intended to, you know, displace a lot of existing tenants and, you know, often change like who rents, you know, the way, you know, what a complex looks like. So in 2022, the late Representative Williams championed a bill requiring towns of 25,000 or more to create fair rent commissions. And there are now 53 fair rent commissions in Connecticut. And that came out of an experience he had with a landlord in Middletown who bought a building with a bunch of elderly tenants and just drastically increased everybody's rent. All right, next slide.
I guess this is back to me. This is a list of the 53 towns. The asterisks indicate towns that were required, that did not have a fair rent commission ordinance as of 2022. So you can see that there are a lot of asterisk towns there which were required to have a fair rent commission. Since then, there have been also 3 smaller towns that have also had newer fair rent commissions. It's if you look in the right-hand column there, it's East Lyme, Killingworth, and Wyndham. And East Lyme and Wyndham are very recent, within the last couple of months. Well, let me move to the next. Let's go on to the next slide. This is the same list of towns, but it's organized in a different way. It's organized by region. And what I'd like you to notice is if you look in the left-hand column under Greater Hartford, you will see that Greater Hartford has 17 fair rent towns with fair rent commissions. And you will notice that very few of them have asterisks. Most of them are older commissions. And what's interesting about this is that people incorrectly say, well, yeah, fair rent commissions are for big cities. But I'd like you to take a look at the Hartford list, and you will see the towns like Glastonbury, Simsbury, Newington, Wethersfield. Those towns all have fair rent commissions and have had them for many years. So that it's important to know that fair rent commissions are something that at least historically has had a level of political acceptability that's not really tied to kind of the notion that they're for urban purposes only. They are really for any place that has renters. And one of the significant reasons, if you look in the right-hand columns, you'll see southeastern and northeastern Connecticut, is a number of those towns have mobile home parks. And mobile home park residents have been very important advocates for for fair rent commissions in towns where they have mobile home parks, which would tend to be more rural areas. Next slide. Oh, this is still me. I'm sorry. Okay. Well, what kinds of complaints can fair rent commissions handle? The primary complaints that you get at fair rent commissions are rent increases. That tends to be what triggers a fair rent complaint. But fair rent commissions are not limited to rent increase complaints, and even in regard to rent, they're not limited to increases in rent. The statute refers to charges, to rental. I think the phrase is rental charges. And so, for example, you can have situations where the problem is less the increase in rent than the maintenance of the property, in the sense that the residents aren't getting value. You can have a situation where, for example, the landlord used to pay the electricity, and now the landlord has the electricity paid over to the tenant. You could even have a situation where the landlord, because they're making that change, lowers the rent, but not nearly as much as the electric bill is going to add to the resident's cost. All of those things are within the broad category of what I would call rent increases. Commissions also have the jurisdiction to consider a range of collateral situations. For example, the landlord's failure to make repairs to comply with housing codes or to maintain the property properly, that can lead to a complaint to a Fair Rent Commission. The landlord who fails to provide services that are required. There's an elevator and the elevator never works, or reductions in services. A new landlord comes in and stops doing things that the old landlord did, but they don't adjust the rent accordingly. And Fair Rent Commissions have jurisdiction to enforce retaliation laws against tenants. Next slide. One question that we've faced many times is what's covered by the Fair Rent Commission Act. To what extent, as they apply to different tenancies. So this is just a sort of a sampling list that tries to pick up sort of all the major things. Just about anything is covered by the Landlord-Tenant Act. Any landlord-tenant relationship is covered. And the important thing is, it's not, the Fair Rent Commissions aren't limited to people who have leases. You can have an oral month-to-month lease. They're not limited in general by there's an exception for essentially summer rentals, but you can have situations, for example, rooming houses, where typically the leases are week to week and may or may not be in writing. They're all covered by the Fair Rent Commission Act. We've been asked whether tenants on Section 8 or on RAP are covered. The answer is yes, they are covered, because those programs do not regulate the rents. They regulate how much the tenant pays of their share of the rent. And in some cases, if the landlord raises the rent too high, the tenant won't be eligible for the program. But they don't regulate the rents themselves, and so they're covered. Interestingly enough, residents in managed care communities are covered. They are renters. They have renters, but they have access to buying collateral services. And then, very important, mobile home parks are covered. Mobile home parks, typically the resident owns the home but rents the land, and so they are renters. They're kind of a hybrid, and they're covered. They're very clearly and explicitly covered by the Fair Rent Commission statute.
All right, I think this one's me.
Yes, next, yes.
Okay, so common Fair Rent Commission decisions, and depending on the municipality, decisions look slightly different, but typically what you'll see is a decision on what the rent will be going forward. So that could be there's no rent increase allowed. That could be there's some rent increase allowed, but it's only, 10% versus what the landlord was asking for, which was a 50% increase. Or it could even be a rent reduction, typically in a case where there are conditions issues and the commission is saying, well, what this person is paying right now is not reasonable based on the condition of the apartment that they're living in. Or it could also be, as Rafi discussed, in a situation where utilities are going up and so the tenant's costs are going far beyond what they were paying previously. Typically, this isn't in the slide, but typically with a Fair Rent Commission decision, the commission will say how long it's in effect. Generally, as a tenant advocate, I'm asking for decisions that are in effect for a year, but to maximize the protection for the tenant. But different commissions have different practices. Often you'll see a delayed or phased in rent increase. So maybe the rent can go up by $50 in 1 month, and then the next month goes up, and then it ends at a certain point. With conditions cases, typically if the rent is being lowered until conditions are repaired, it will be linked to a housing code violation report, and often the commission will say that the rent is increased until the landlord can demonstrate that they've passed a clean inspection by the health department or other municipal enforcement agency. And then commissions can also order the landlord to cease retaliatory conduct. So for example, if a landlord starts an eviction against a tenant, and it's a retaliation for that tenant complaining about conditions or filing a fair rent commission complaint, the commission can issue a cease and desist order. And we do have some case law showing that courts look at that and will dismiss a case that's been filed because the commission has issued a cease and desist order. Commission can also, of course, allow a rent increase to go forward and determine that it is in fact fair. All right, different factors. There are 13 factors that are listed in the state statute. The Fair Rent Commission can is supposed to consider them all, but does not have to give them equal weight. And the commission is also allowed to consider other relevant factors. The main things that matter are the amount of the increase and history of past increases, what is included in the rent and what the tenant has to pay for separately, and then how much the tenant is paying for utilities. For example, if the tenant is in a really drafty apartment and paying really astronomical heating bills, that can be factors in. The condition of the apartment, if there are code violation orders, the landlord's costs, the tenant's income, and availability of housing that's affordable to them, and then comparable rents in the neighborhood and the town that they live in. And I will just flag on that, comparable rents are a factor, but even if a landlord is asking for an increase that puts the rent within the market, the commission can limit the increase if it's going to, double the tenant's rent in order to do that. Or the size of the increase is so large that it's just not reasonable to ask the tenant to pay that increase in one go. Or if, conditions justify it, other factors can come into play. And this next slide, is that Rafi?
Back to me, I think, yeah, what other important benefits do fair rent commissions produce? One of the things that we've learned is that there are significant either side benefits or in some cases actually explicitly intended benefits from having a fair rent commission. What I would call the side benefit is that a lot of times, a lot of fair rent commission disputes come about because landlords and tenants don't talk to each other. Rent increases are presented as all or nothing. Tenant doesn't like it, they can move, and the tenants often are afraid to say anything to the landlord about it. When a fair rent commission case is filed, typically the staff of the commission will try to generate some communication between the landlord and the tenant to explore whether there might be a compromise position that's acceptable. And it very often turns out there is. Sometimes it might be a smaller rent increase that's acceptable to the tenant and acceptable to the landlord. Sometimes as the tenant is complaining about things that haven't been fixed, the landlord fixes them and the tenant doesn't have that much of a problem about the rent increase anymore. So that's that. I don't know to what extent that was intended, but that's a very, very common thing that happens with fair rent commissions. And it's a reason why it's important that fair rent commissions not reject cases out of hand, why the staff not say, well, we don't take that kind of case, because the case has good possibility of settling without it ever getting to the hearing stage. The second thing is very much an intended benefit of fair rent commissions, and we've already mentioned that, which is the impact on housing code enforcement. When you have landlords who are resistant to complying with the code, if tenants start withholding the rent, there is a very significant possibility they're going to get evicted. But a fair rent commission is in a position to say to the landlord, we are lowering the rent and we're going to keep it lower, at least until such time as you comply with what our municipal code enforcement agency says you must do in order to be in code compliance. And that becomes a very powerful tool of housing code enforcement. And one of the things that Sarah discovered when she was doing history of the fair rent commissions, that was articulated back in 1969 as one of the important reasons for having a fair rent commission. So although it's, in a sense, we're calling it here an other benefit, that one actually is very much an anticipated benefit. Next slide.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about how tenants can use fair rent commissions to organize with their neighbors. Of course, most Fair Rent Commission complaints are going to be individual, but as we've talked about, a scenario we continue to see is a new landlord coming in and essentially raising everyone's rent very significantly to price people out of the building. So fair rent commissions can be a great tactic that tenant unions or groups of tenants, neighbors can use to get individual relief and to support each other's cases to have a better outcome for everybody. Fair rent commissions can allow groups of tenants and tenant unions to fight back against rent increases or also poor conditions and provide some relief while strengthening the ability of all tenants as part of a broader campaign. I'm just going to give sort of two examples on the next one. So one example here in Hartford, the folks on the bottom, this is the Weathersfield Avenue Tenant Union, and they had a situation where they got a new landlord, actually Alpha Capital, who some folks might be aware of, who really drastically increased everyone's rent. And tenants immediately started talking, thinking about what they could do, and they used a variety of tactics to fight back. One of them was many of them filed complaints at the Hartford Fair Rent Commission to get lower rent. And then they also did, with the help of Dahlia, a protected rent strike, through payment of rent into court, where they were, because of all the code issues that were not repaired, started a lawsuit to start to pay their rent into court until things were fixed. Alpha eventually sold it to a new landlord, and they won, through a variety of tactics and really sticking in there for a long time, a rent freeze, repairs, and the right to remain. So in this example, the Fair Rent Commission didn't give them all the relief that they needed, but it allowed them to come together. You don't need a lawyer to file a Fair Rent Commission complaint. It's a fairly simple form, so it's an easy action that tenants can take. That got some folks relief and gave them more bargaining power as a group, along with these other tactics to get a better outcome. Another example is, in Bloomfield. This is a poster made by one of the other, tenant unions members' kids in Bloomfield. I'll just back up a little bit and say I've been doing research on Fair Rent Commissions. I found out that the Bloomfield Fair Rent Commission was started by a tenant union at Wedgwood Apartments, and then later in the 2000s was really revitalized by a new tenant union that had formed at those same apartments, which is like pretty cool. And, at this tenant union at Manor House, they filed a lot of complaints, around conditions and rent increases with the Bloomfield Fair Rent Commission that gave, around 10 households rent freezes and reductions, which gave people, the stability and the confidence to talk to more of their neighbors and to form a tenant union that now has 80% of the complex in it as a member and is working on negotiating with the new landlord, for relief for everybody. So another example of, Fair Rent Commissions gave folks some stability, didn't give them everything maybe they wanted, but that was enough to help them, work together and build towards more. And just a few other things about how Fair Rent Commissions can handle complaints from organized tenants. All Fair Rent Commissions have the authority to consolidate complaints for a hearing, which of course is more efficient for the tenant, for the landlord, for the Fair Rent Commission, so they aren't hearing the same testimony 5, 10, 15 times. And, in some of our Fair Rent Commissions that have newer ordinances, they also explicitly recognize tenant unions and, allow a tenant union to file a complaint on behalf of its members or group complaints and things like that to sort of facilitate these group complaints. But even in the absence of that, organizing groups of tenants at a building to all file Fair Rent Commission complaints can get folks relief. And this is our contact information. We'll definitely send out the slides beforehand, and that's the end of our presentation. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. If I don't see any in the chat, so if you want to start putting some questions in the chat, and then once we get through those, if you want to just raise your hand and I'll call on you and unmute for your question. So Lauren's question, what sort of trainings do the commissioners get? Are they trained to create comps? Do all commissions use the 13 criteria? So I'll start with that. The 13 factors are set forth in the state law. So all of the Fair Rent Commissions, have to use them. They don't have to consider them in all instances. It's only as applicable, but those are standardized across Fair Rent Commissions. In terms of training, that varies by municipality. Rafi and I also do training for fair rent commissions on, the law and the factors and things like that. But it varies how municipalities handle that. Typically, it includes, FOI training on how to run a meeting, other training that they do for commissions. And in some commissions, they do practice hearings and other things as well. And in terms of creating comps, that is usually not the responsibility of the commission. So if a landlord wants to present or a tenant wants to present, comparable apartments, that's up to them to provide that information. Rick, sorry, I answered all that. Rafi, do you have anything you want to add, or Dahlia?
Yeah, I want to add a couple things. One is in relation to comps. Comps tend to be overvalued. They are not as helpful as you might think they are. And the reason is, to be comparable, the apartments have to be comparable. And it's hard to know what other apartments are. So for example, there may be apartments out there that have higher rents, and the landlord would say, well, I should be able to justify this increase because other rents are higher. But those apartments may be nicer, or they may be larger, or they may be different. They may be in a different part of the city. So there are all sorts of reasons why it's hard to do comparability. In addition, those apartments are probably, most cases, you would know what the asking rents are. That's to say, like, what are they advertised at? But we know that tenants who are already in place typically pay lower rents. So you'd really have to know what the rents actually are of tenants who are already there. And finally, comps are one of the 13 factors. So in my view, it's a mistake of a Fair Rent Commission to overvalue information on comps, because then you're tending to forget the other factors. In the question about how they address the factors, some commissions actually, I think, go down the list and talk about them. I think most commissions, though, talk much more generally about what seems to be fair and what doesn't seem to be fair. And in the course of doing that, they will end up on focusing on 2 or 3 or 4 of the factors that seem most influential to them. And that's consistent with the statute, because the statute says 13 factors is applicable. And in different circumstances, different factors will be applicable. So Fair Rent Commission decisions don't necessarily go down a list and say, here's how we decided factor 1, here's how we decided factor 2, because it's not the way people think in that kind of an environment. That tends to be a more holistic approach. At least that's my experience.
Stacy's question: what's the best way to connect clients with the local Fair Rent Commission? Do they need a lawyer? Does someone want to take this?
You can say typically the best way is literally if I'm working with a town that I don't know, I start by just Googling town name, Fair Rent Commission, and finding whatever contact is up on the town website. No, you don't need a lawyer. Most tenants make Fair Rent Commission complaints without a lawyer, and the system is designed with the assumption that most people will not be going forward with legal representation.
Rafi, do you have anything you want to add?
No.
All right. So that's all of our questions in the chat. If folks want to add more or raise your hand, and I'll call on you to unmute with any other questions. I'm going to give it a moment, and then I'm going to start asking.
Can I say I have some more things to say if there aren't any questions, but
we'll give it one. Okay, Rafi, you start, but then please raise your hand if you'd like to ask something or.
Yeah, I think that it's important to understand that Fair Rent Commissions come with a statutory purpose. In other words, without a Fair Rent Commission, the tenant really has no remedy. And the legislature, in creating Fair Rent Commissions, is really doing it because of a need for renters to have some kind of a mechanism for raising issues about increased rents. But that doesn't mean that Fair Rent Commissions are tenant advocacy groups. Fair Rent Commissions are a little bit like mini judges, and commission members need to think about both sides and take into consideration. A lot of Fair Rent Commissions, by ordinance, have some sort of a balance among landlords, and tenants may even require that there's be 1 or 2 tenants and 1 or 2 landlords as members of the commission. But what's important, I think, to see is that the ultimate purpose is what we call housing stability. The purpose is that tenants should not have to move. And that's just an important recognition. And that's one of the things I think we try to tell commissioners is that look at these issues from that perspective. This is what's going on reasonable. The other thing that's worth noting is that for certain categories of tenants, essentially seniors and people who are disabled who live in larger buildings, the statute refers them to the Fair Rent Commission in towns with fair rent commissions, but uses slightly different wording as to what the commission is supposed to look for. They're supposed to look for whether or not any rent increase is fair and equitable. That's the terminology. All the terminology, though, is in terms of what I would call equity and fairness. I mean, whether you talk about harsh and unconscionable or fair and equitable, you're sort of saying the same thing. You're saying, is this fair to the tenant or not? And that's what the commission's designed to figure out.
All right, Dahlia, I'm going to ask you a question, but folks, please raise your hand or put others in the chat. Dahlia, could you describe what it looks like, a typical process? I know that commissions have their own procedures, but from filing to decision, like kind of what that timeline looks like and what that hearing looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So typically a tenant will file a complaint, and then I would say within that week, the commission will reach out to both the tenant and the landlord to notify them, hey, this complaint has been received. At that point, usually the commission will also, inform the tenant that they're protected against retaliation, let the landlord know that the tenant should be paying the last agreed upon rent, so the rent before the increase, while waiting for a decision from the commission. And then most commissions, somewhere in the first month or so after the tenant has filed the complaint, will try to mediate with the tenant and the landlord to come to some sort of agreement, either by having a meeting with both of them or having a town staff person who's communicating with the landlord and the tenant and sort of coming back and forth with different offers. I don't have statistics on the number of cases that resolve that way, but anecdotally, I believe a lot end up being able to be resolved without going to a hearing. If the tenant and the landlord, also in the meantime, if the tenant has asserted that there are conditions issues, the town might, the Fair Rent Commission staff person might connect the tenant with housing code enforcement to get an inspection, like sort of do investigation. Different commissions have different capacity to be getting involved in that. But basically, if the tenant landlord can't reach an agreement, then they'll schedule a hearing. The hearing is, some towns do remote, some towns do in person. They are typically in the evening on a week, Monday through Friday evening. And they are relatively informal hearings. It's not like going to court. It's usually in, a conference room in the town hall. The tenant will have an opportunity to present their side and their position on why the rent increase is unreasonable. The landlord will have a chance to present their side and why they believe that the rent increase is reasonable. And then the commissioners will have a chance to ask questions of both sides to try to get more information. At that point, once everybody's had a chance to present, the commission typically will deliberate right there, right in front of everybody, and talk through the different factors, what they're considering. They may go back and forth about different proposed decisions, oh, maybe we can allow X increase, and then somebody else might propose something else. They'll come to something that they can all agree on, then they typically have to vote on it. And then they will, if it passes, they'll issue the decision. Typically, then they'll issue a written decision that gets mailed out in the next couple of days. So I would say that's just sort of generally what it looks like.
All right, we have some questions in the chat, which is great. So the first one, are there any regional fair rent commissions representing more than one town? And not at this point, but the state statute does allow it. And we've heard that there's interest in doing a regional commission, which, because fair rent commissions have benefits, both for the town, for improving like relationships between landlords and tenants and giving tenants a place to go, to fight back against these really egregious increases. It really is to everyone's benefit to have them. So I know there's been interest in exploring having regional commissions, which are allowed, but so far there are none. And then Alicia's question, how have you seen towns or grassroots organizations successfully raise awareness about fair rent commissions to those who could benefit it, but may not be very connected to their government options? Rafi or Dahlia, do either of you, sorry, my cat is blocking my screen. Want to start?
Um, I don't have much of a sense of what towns have done. It's clearly helpful for towns to publicize the existence of a commission. Some of the towns, I think, have done the exact opposite because they're afraid of getting complaints. And that's certainly the wrong way to go. So, I mean, I do think in some places, some of the nonprofits have organized kind of rent fairs where part of the purpose is to inform tenants about what's available to them if they have disputes. I mean, I think it's worth looking into whether there are ways in which there could be some form of systematic notice about when rent increases are made. I mean, one of the things that's interesting is that this past year, the General Assembly adopted a statute that requires 45 days advance written notice of a rent increase, so as to stop the situation where, a week or less than a week before a lease term expires, the tenant all of a sudden discovers there's going to be a rent increase coming. It's 45 days in general. That would typically be with 1-year leases. It's 30 days for a month-to-month lease, 7 days for a week-to-week lease. But because it's a written notice that needs to be given, it's conceivable you could have a system in place in which those notices would need to disclose the availability of fair rent commissions. That's not in place now, though. That does not now exist. I don't know, Dahlia may have a better sense of what other towns are doing.
I have two things to add, and then Dahlia. One is that like New Haven, for example, like is very much out in the community and has, someone who worked with the Fair Rent Commission who's like does outreach work basically and goes and speaks at events, will help people fill out complaints right then and there, so making it accessible. And then just another example, I think the three of us have all done presentations for tenants and talking about how to use fair rent commissions, and that can be really important because folks know other people in their community and their building and kind of spread information that way.
Honestly, I don't have a ton to add. I don't know that much about what commissions are doing. I can say anecdotally, I live in Willimantic, and I know since it passed, people have been, posting in the town like Facebook pages and sending it's in the newspaper. So just trying to get the word out that way. But agreed that that's a key piece of it.
Lisa's question, how many towns in Connecticut have fair rent commissions? What are the key circumstances that move a town to stand up such a commission? I'll start. There are 53. So 53 out of 169 towns have fair rent commissions. We're getting closer to majority. And so some of those were required to have them because by state law, because they have a population of 25,000 or more. But like we talked about, there's 8 towns that are smaller that have them, 3 of them very recently. And East Lyme is the most recent new fair rent commission, and the driving situation there was a landlord, again, Alpha Capital, who we mentioned earlier, bought a complex in town where mostly elderly tenants reside and really drastically increased everyone's rent. $800 to $1,000 rent increases. So that was effectively almost doubling people's rent. And without a fair rent commission, even if folks are protected by just cause, there's not a clear remedy. So the town acted really quickly. The tenants mobilized, the community, rallied around them, and they have set up a fair rent commission. But ideally, there would be a fair rent commission in place before something like that happens. So, that has been like one example of, what has driven a town to do a fair rent commission. But it's good to have it in place beforehand and, to give tenants somewhere to go. Do either of you have anything to add? Okay, so we're almost done here, but if just cause were to be passed, do you anticipate an increase of complaints for fair rent increases? I honestly don't think so. I think the main effect of just cause would be on no fault evictions. So I don't know that it would change the number of fair rent commission complaints. Do tenants have to be legal residents to go to a fair rent commission? Do either of you want to take this?
I don't, I'm not aware there is such thing as a legal resident. And so I would say that the tenant needs to be a resident. And I don't think the tenant can complain about an increase if they don't live there. But there is no law that I'm aware of that distinguishes legal residents from any other kind of residence. So to that extent, I would say they just have to be a resident.
And then an appeals process.
Yeah, and yes, there's an appeals process. The statute provides that you can, either party can appeal from a commission decision to the Superior Court, which normally would be the housing session if it's a housing court or the housing division. And there are some cases. For a long time, there were very, very few cases. We're seeing some additional appeals now, but there's a rule that applies, that's really a well-established rule, a court rule in reviewing appeals from administrative agencies. And the Fair Rent Commission is a municipal administrative agency. And that is, the court will sustain the decision of the agency as long as a rational agency could possibly have come to the decision they came to. So they don't retry the case. So what that says is, as long as as reasonable people might have come to this decision, even though the judge would have voted the other way if the judge were there, the decision stands. So typically, when you get, the Fair Rent Commission decisions will be sustained by the courts unless they didn't follow proper procedures. And so a lot of appeals are focused on the procedural aspects rather than the substantive decision, because there, if you can show that the commission didn't follow the rules, then you might have the basis for it being overturned. So yes, you can appeal, but it's hard to win an appeal in a Fair Rent Commission case.
I think we are at the end of our time. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Sarah, Rafi, and Dahlia for your presentation. I have the chat saved and I'll be able to send them the questions after the fact. But thank you all and hope to see you in the next few sessions. Have a good afternoon.